So before we talk about self-correction in the long run, I want to review these three graphs. If you look at graph number 1, we see that our LRAS is to the right of our intersection of the short run and aggregate demand. Another way of saying that is YF is greater than Y1. And this right here is called the recessionary gap. And there's a reason we don't necessarily want this, and the reason it's called inefficiency. This is inefficient, and if you remember the guiding question of economics, it's all about how do we make use of our scarce resources. The last thing we want to do when handling scarce resources is use them inefficiently. So number 1, this recessionary gap, this is not necessarily something we want to see. If we go to number 2, we have this opposite scenario where YF is less than Y1. And if we remember the LRAS, it shows our full employment output, and it also represents our potential as an economy. And so this is showing that we are past our potential. We're overutilizing our factors of production. Another word for this is unsustainable. And this is not necessarily something we want to see either. We want to correct this. We don't want our economy to be unsustainable or inefficient. What we want is this third. We want this equilibrium. We want the LRAS, YF, to be equal to Y1. I'm going to call this home. We want to be here. It's nice and safe. So if you see graphs 1 or 2, we're going to call that disequilibrium. And then graph number 3, this is going to be long run equilibrium. So now knowing these 3 graphs, we can kind of get in to these 3 different ways we can correct these graphs. So the first way, it's called fiscal policy. And so if I am a Congress person and I notice that our economy is in a inflationary gap, which is this graph right here, what I would want to do as a congressman is find a way to bring this aggregate demand back down. And influencing aggregate demand is more popular than influencing aggregate supply, because there's kind of known methods such as raising taxes. Raising taxes, this will lead to less money in people's pockets, which will lead to, due to the income effect, less spending. And since aggregate demand is all about spending, this fiscal policy of raising taxes could decrease the aggregate demand and ultimately lead us back to that long-run equilibrium. There's a second option called monetary policy, where this has to do with banks, the Federal Reserve, and interest rates. Let's say we don't increase taxes, and instead we enact a monetary policy of increasing interest rates, effectively making money more expensive. And this is going to have the same effect on aggregate demand as well. It's going to be decreasing aggregate demand with the intention of coming back to that full employment output, that long-run equilibrium. Well, there's a third option as well, and it's called self-correction. And it is the absence of fiscal policy and monetary policy. So self-correction will only happen if we decide not to mess with taxes and not to mess with interest rates. Let's leave everything alone. Let's take no action, and let's see what happens. So the idea behind this is that this initial aggregate demand increase from 80 to 82 is going to set off a chain reaction. And this chain reaction, if left untouched and if left to its own devices, will ultimately fix itself. So let's see how that works. I'm going to rewrite this right here. Self-correction in the long run. Let's do a nice little bam. So this idea is that if we go back up to this graph and look what happens to this AD2, we have an increase in GDP. Our YF increased to Y1. So this is what's going to set everything off, this increase in GDP. Because if you remember, unemployment is also tied into GDP, meaning that if our GDP is going up, that is an indicator. Let's put a 1 here. That's an indicator that our unemployment rate, oops, that should be an R. Our unemployment rate is going down. So let's say our unemployment rate decreases. Let's say it started at around 3%, and all of a sudden our unemployment rate is maybe 1%. Or we can get crazy and say maybe it's 0%. Yeah, let's go crazy. Let's say our unemployment rate is 0%. We had a vast increase in GDP. And now that's kind of the short run. That's what happened immediately. But now let's try to think about what problems or what might occur in the long run after time has passed. How might this unemployment rate going down, how might that affect the economy? How might that affect the business cycle? How might that affect businesses in general? Well, think about it this way. Let's say we are a small business owner and we are opening up a new coffee shop. Let's just draw a picture. We got a little coffee shop. It's called Coffee. Classy. And we put a sign out front, big sign, and it says, "Now hiring." Now hiring. Well, here's a question for you. If our unemployment rate is so low, and we're using this crazy example of 0%, who is going to want to work for your new business? And you start to think about that, and well, you might get someone who wants to leave their job and join your coffee shop, but why would they do that? And there's maybe two reasons. There's maybe a couple more, but there's two main reasons that are coming to my mind right now. Reason number one being that you are really cool and they want to work for you. Wow, I can't believe that guy opened a coffee shop. I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to transfer jobs to his coffee shop because of how cool it is. So that's maybe likely. Number two, maybe a little bit more reasonable. The second reason is that you are paying more. And this is the more real scenario. It's more real than this. It's the more real scenario of what's going to be happening with a lower unemployment rate. If businesses want to start hiring more people, they must increase their wages. And that's the third thing on this chain reaction. Wages are going to go up. And you can think about it this way too. The lower the unemployment rate, the more competition there is. I'm going to write that like that's like 2.5, right? The lower the unemployment rate, if unemployment goes down, competition goes up. It is harder to get workers. And the surefire way to recruit a worker is to increase your wages. So that's kind of the third step. Now, what's the fourth step going to be? The fourth step after, what happens after we increase our wages? Let me do a little editing right quick. Let me do this. Boom. Let's get that back to black. Boom. Okay. So step number 4, we now have an increase in wages, because that's the only way to get workers now, because the unemployment rate's so low. Step number 4 is that if you remember the short run aggregate supply, what can shift the short run left and right? Well, if you remember me saying that if things become cheaper or easier, then generally production is going to increase. And if things get more expensive or harder to make, the SRAS will decrease. And this increase in wages, you can think of that as an input price, right? That's part of our supply chain. That's part of our production. So if it becomes more expensive to hire workers, it's more expensive for us to make our goods, if we're the suppliers. So this increase in wages is eventually going to lead to a decrease. Let's color that in. Boom, boom. A decrease in the short run aggregate supply. And then what's going to happen then? How does a decrease in the short run, what does that look like on a graph, and what's that going to lead to? Well, if we just scoot back up to this mess right here, we're using this graph. We're going to take our yellow. So currently, we're right here. And if our SRAS decreases, boop, boop, decreases because of these higher wages, what has happened to our price level? Our price level has rose even more. And this makes sense, because if we're paying our workers more and we still want to make a profit, we got to raise our prices. So we come back down here, this decrease in the SRAS, this is going to be raising the price level. And this also coincides, these two are kind of together. This coincides with the decrease of GDP. So it's interesting to look at 1 through 6. It's interesting to look forward and backwards, see how it started with an increase in GDP. And it ends with a decrease in GDP. And that's self-correction. That's the idea behind self-correction, that any change is going to ultimately lead to the opposite. So if we want to run through this again, the increase in GDP, it lowered our unemployment rate. This lowered unemployment rate increased our wages. There's kind of a side note here. This is very interesting to look into how unemployment affects wages. There's also another theory that says how when unemployment rate decreases, it gives more power to the worker. And when the worker is more empowered, maybe even the worker takes it upon himself to ask for a wage, there's another interesting theory if you guys want to look into that. But the other idea being competition, right? If you're a business and you want to hire someone and there's a lot of competition, you've got to increase the wage. This increase in wages makes things more expensive for the producer. It decreases the aggregate supply, which increases the price level, which decreases the GDP. Now, there may be another question of, does this really work? And, I believe the consensus is that this works. However, right, there's always this however. We have this very vague term, and it's called long run. This works in the long run, which you should be asking yourself, well, how long is long? And there is no real answer to that. You can only project, you can only guess, make assumptions and hypothesis, But if you think about it, if you're a member in Congress, or if you are the chairman of the Federal Reserve, you can't really go on TV and tell the general public, don't worry, it's all going to correct in the long run. You know, even if you had that answer of, well, the long run is 2 years long. Let's say we knew for a fact this could self-correct in 2 years. You know, constituents and the general public, they don't want to wait. They don't want to hear it's going to take 2 years for everything to go back to normal, which is why we see a lot of fiscal policy and a lot of monetary policy. These two will generally see people talking about. You'll definitely see fiscal and monetary policy on the news. I'm failing to think of an example from history where we let the market self-correct. Although you will see politicians say, maybe throw out their ideas of, well, let's wait before enacting fiscal or monetary policy. Let's wait a little while and see, you know, what if the long run, what if this is only 1 month? What if we wait and see what happens and then act first? So you will hear some politicians kind of go with that, let's wait and see. And the reason why they're saying that is this, because they're buying into this theory of any change will ultimately correct itself.